Okay, so let's discuss two of the most important questions or the most common questions which is asked in any Java interview related to exception handling. And the first is, what is exception hierarchy and what are checked and unchecked exceptions? So exception hierarchy look like this. On the topmost, of course, we know that there is object class, and then object class has a subclass called as throwable class, and this is where all your exception handling and exception hierarchy starts with the throwable class. And throwable class have a couple of subclasses. One subclass is error and its subclasses, then exception class and its subclasses. Now again there is another categorization. So under exception there is a runtime exception class, and then runtime exception class will again have its subclasses, and then exception class will then again have some subclasses which are not in the hierarchy of runtime exception class. Now how this is relevant? This is relevant from the perspective of checked exception and unchecked exception, which is another common interview question. So as per Java documentation, there are three kind of exceptions. First is checked exception, then error and runtime exception, and then yeah, this is how it's the exception. So our first categorization of exception is like this: checked exception, error, and runtime exception. Now this is not how we commonly commonly talk about the exceptions in Java. We commonly talk about exceptions in Java as either checked exception or unchecked exception, and unchecked exception are further classified as error and runtime exception. So this is what we saw, right? So talking about this diagram, this particular hierarchy is called as checked exception, and this hierarchy and this hierarchy are unchecked exception. Or if you see it from tree perspective, this tree is your checked exception tree, and this tree is your unchecked exception tree, right? Now which one of them is compile time exception and which one is a runtime exception? This is the bullet for that one. So checked exceptions are also known as compile time exception, which basically means that you can expect them at the compile time, and you will have to deal with checked exceptions at the compile time. If you don't deal with the checked exceptions at the compile time, then you are going to run into some sort of compile time error. And how do you deal with the checked exceptions at compile time? Either you throw the checked exception or you catch the checked exception, right? So this is how you deal with the checked exception at the compile time. Now coming to the unchecked exception, unchecked exceptions are also known as the runtime exception, which basically means that they occur at the runtime. So you really cannot anticipate the unchecked exceptions because they are occurring at the runtime, right? So for example, at runtime, you can run into a runtime you can run into a null pointer exception, right? Now, if someone is an experienced coder and have decent knowledge, then he would be able to figure out the possible scenarios for runtime exception. But as such, runtime exceptions, you can't anticipate. So they occur at the runtime only. So that's the unchecked exception. Now, this point, I think in a way we have already discussed that any throwable which is not subtype of runtime exception and error is a checked exception, and checked exceptions are subjected to catch and specify requirement. This is what we saw, right? Like that this particular tree is your checked exception, and checked exceptions are subjected to catch and specify requirement, which is to say that if you are having a checked exception, then either you catch it or you specify it. Specify means that you need to have a throws clause for that particular checked exception. Now I have captured another very important statement from the Oracle documentation, which is around that how you should classify a particular exception. Suppose you're writing a piece of the code. Now, how do you decide that a particular exception should be a checked exception or an unchecked or runtime exception? So this is what Oracle documentation, Oracle recommends, that if a client can reasonably be expected to recover from an exception, then make it a checked exception. And if a client cannot do anything to recover from the exception, then it should be an unchecked exception. This basically means that, now let me quickly tell you few examples of checked exception. Few example of checked exception is like an input output exception or a file not found exception, and few type of unchecked exceptions are array about out of bound exception and null pointer exception. Okay, now a client can is expected to is reasonably expected to recover from a file not found, right? So for example, if you are reading a file, then a client can put the file and he can recover from those kind of exception, right? So that is where you will make it a checked exception. So this is the guideline which Oracle says on how you should classify an exception, whether it should be checked exception or unchecked exception. So this is what two most common questions which are asked in interview. One is what is exception hierarchy and what are checked exceptions and unchecked exception. Next we will see, and in the next video we will talk about what is exception chaining or checked exception. But for now, this is for this particular video. Thank you.